Hello, everyone. I'm AJ from ProWritingAid, and thank you for joining for another session of Writing for Effective Leadership, a series which we hold on the third Wednesday of every month. I've spent over 10 years designing and teaching undergraduate and MBA level writing and communication courses. And in these webinars, I discuss and learn from all of you also about how exceptional writing can boost your business, studies, or career in a practical way. So I also want to let you know about our first ProWritingAid 101 for business writers that happens this month. Whether you've just started with ProWritingAid or you'd like to know how to get the most out of this powerful editing tool, our walkthrough and Q&A can help. And so that's going to be with our head of client solutions, Tom Wild, and our B2B digital marketing manager, Micah McGuire. And that will happen on March 24th. 2 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. UK time. And the link to that business writing 101 is I sent in the earlier links to you that you'll find in the chat. So wonderful. So now I'm going to share my screen and we're going to jump right into our presentation for today. Okay, so the presentation today is called Effective Leadership, how to use framing to persuade. And if you've been to the previous two Effective Leadership ProWritingAid sessions, you'll see that we really believe at ProWritingAid that leadership is really key, and that we really believe strongly too that communication is core to being a good leader. And we do know, let's just make it sure that we agree that leadership does matter. And according to a 2015 study of 50,000 managers by two leadership experts, Jack Sanger and Joe Folkman, they found this. They found that poor leaders lost money for their organization. Good leaders made a profit, but the best, the extraordinary leaders, more than doubled the company's profits in comparison to the other 90% of leaders. So it's when leadership is really good, it's really good for the financial outlook of the company. So we know leadership matters. It's at the same time, we do know too that leadership is really difficult. That it is very hard to be a leader. And I think many of us who've been leaders, or any of you who've been leaders, that you've also been led by people, and you know how difficult it is to kind of get on the same page and get aligned and have ultimately have a good working relationship. And so this McKinsey study came out yesterday. Actually, they found that more than half of American workers claim that their boss is mildly or highly toxic, which I think is a striking statistic, and also is a little bit disheartening, right? So I believe that one of the reasons why more than half of Americans are finding their leaders toxic or mildly toxic is because of the relationship and the way that they're communicating with one another. And I think if we're ever going to improve that statistic, what we really need to do is to think about how these leaders and how everyone is communicating. And specifically, we need to think about how can we communicate in a way that is more empathetic and relationship driven. And so one of those tools to become more empathetic and to develop better relationships between managers and teams is framing. And so before we jump into what framing is, though, I have a multiple choice quiz for all of you. So let me set up this real quick. Imagine you're at work and you're getting feedback from one of your managers. And one of the big things that the manager is trying to bring up to you is this issue of how you prioritize. This might be personal to me, by the way. This is something I need to work on. But so I want you to imagine, of these three options here, A, B, or C, if the goal is to actually give you feedback so that you then improve upon that area. So if the goal is to improve upon this area, which of these three, if you could put this in the chat, which of these three, and you can send it to me personally or to everyone, but which of these three would you prefer to have as the way you receive the feedback? So imagine your manager is speaking to you, and which of these three would you like? Okay, we're getting some good answers in here. It's striking. And so would anyone who, right, there's this kind of obviously, but I think that while many of us would say, on the surface, this is obvious, would some people mind sharing in the chat, what is it? What is it about C? Or perhaps what accounts for the fact that everyone on this webinar today has said, I want C? What is it? I would love to hear from people, because I have my own in interpretation, but I'd love to hear from anyone. If you wouldn't mind writing that in the chat. What makes C better than B and A? Yeah, this is great, right? So I think one of the themes that everybody's saying is it's positive. And I think the other thing that I want to emphasize too is that there's a certain quality of A, B, and C where they're all trying to do the same thing, right? They're all trying to get you or me, AJ, to improve on my prioritization. And I think what we'd all, I don't know what you all think, but I think there's sometimes there's a natural tendency, and when we're communicating to people, is we might say A or B just because that's what's in our heads. But just because that's what's in our heads doesn't mean that that's the right way that we want to present this to people. And so I think as we'll develop this and this is a really small example, that words matter, right? The other thing that I want to emphasize about this too is that imagine this minor, this micro moment between a manager and a team member. Imagine this multiplied, 500, 1,000 times over a year. And I would argue this is what constitutes a relationship, or what accounts for a toxic relationship. So what is framing? Framing is really about using empathy to select words that are more likely to achieve the communication goal. And Zara, you're right. I wasn't saying that this was necessarily a formal review, but when you get feedback, maybe it could be other kinds of feedback, but just like, if you think, I think there's a natural thing where if a manager gives feedback in version A or version B, my hypothesis is that manager is likely talking to everyone on their team in that same mode, right? Without framing, as we'll kind of discuss. So all of these micro moments without framing and without thinking about how people are receiving information from us, they constitute a relationship. And if any of you have children, and if any of you have, if you've ever discussed communication strategies with your partner, I mean, this is everything, right? It really is about the words that we use and understanding people. And I think it's built on this idea that generally we don't naturally think before we speak. We just react. It's just, I think it's our automated autopilot process that we have a reaction, it's in our brain, and we got to get it out. I'd argue most of the time what we say, this is just my own view, doesn't work. I think this is why we have phrases like, well, what I mean is, or do you get what I'm saying? Or we say, I'm not clear, perhaps, right? These are all these little phrases that suggest that maybe our first inclination, our first draft of anything we say or write is probably wrong, 90% of the time wrong. But that's okay once we embrace that. And so we know that we have to follow up all the time. We have to clarify, and we have to rework our message. And there's some data that proves that almost this idea that most communication is in fact miscommunication. And so Josh Bernoff is a famous writing consultant, and what he found from a survey that he sent out is he said that 61% of respondents said that what they read is frequently unclear, and that 82% of respondents found that poorly written material, waste their time. And then on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 completely ineffective, 1 is completely ineffective, and then 10 is completely effective. They rated what they get at a 5.4. And so if we, because I'm often in school mind, a 5.4 is failing. It's a 55. That's, you have failed. And what basically these people are saying is, on average, people are failing in their communication, but this is okay, right? And I think one of the things that I like to say a lot is that if you're a human, writing is very hard. We just have to embrace that idea. And Cecilia, I think your point, though, that there's some people who think, oh, candor and honesty and transparency means that I don't have to think about the way that I'm framing things, that this is, we value. And I think that's a false choice, that, that to reframe something and to think thoughtfully about how we organize our ideas for someone so that they really get it is in fact being transparent, and is in fact being, is using candor. So, okay, so what do we need to be? We realize that most communication is perhaps miscommunication. I mean, even right now, I'm talking to all of you, and it's likely and understandable and fine that some of you might not be getting what I'm saying, right? Or not be perhaps buying into what I'm saying. And that's part of it. So we're never trying to perfect our communication. We're always on that journey of mastery, just always trying to get better. So what we know, we need to be clearer, we need to be more persuasive, and we need to do it more quickly. And framing is a strategy built on linguistics and neuroscience. And it's just this fundamental idea that words create reality. And so people understand reality through the language within which they receive that reality. And words automatically activate associations and mental images in people's minds. So a famous author, a famous neuroscientist, George Lakoff, wrote a great book about framing called Don't Think of an Elephant. And the joke about his book, obviously, is when he says, do not think of an elephant, despite the fact that he's asking you not to think about an elephant, you now are thinking about an elephant. And this is how language kind of works in, oddly enough, like contradictory ways. It's almost the same as when we say things like, look, don't take this as an insult. And all of us go, well, here comes the insult. Despite the fact that we try to say this is not an insult, all people can hear is insult, which activates associations and mental images. And then again, like, these are sort of the vessels, the words and the construction of the sentences are the vessels that carry meaning to all of us. So. And the truth is that we just find framing everywhere in business. And what we find are sort of 3 ways of thinking about framing in business. We find places where the framing, where there is no framing. We find places where the framing is working. And then we find places where it's almost what we might call like an unethical framing, right? Or a manipulative style of framing. So let's think about Google. And mission statements. Mission statements are often big frames. This is how this company wants everyone at the organization and externally to perceive our company. These words are literally going to shape how people think of us. So Google initially had the mission statement of don't be evil. And then I think what they realized, because they ended up then going to the phrase do the right thing. So maybe I'll throw it out to all of you. Let's take what we just talked about, that words activate associations and mental images. So does anyone I'd love for everyone in the chat to tell me when we think of framing, what might be the problem of the frame that don't be evil activates in our minds? So if someone were to say to you, for example, oh yeah, I'm just on a daily basis, I don't want to be evil. Right, Jim, right. All we can think about is evil, and it's kind of almost where what Google's telling us is here's where we don't want to go on a daily basis. And then Google realizes, wait, like it's a negative statement. Exactly. Like, let's think about, let's activate a frame in our listeners' minds that like, this is what we're trying to do. We want you to associate Google with the right thing. We don't want you to associate Google with evil. Okay. There was an incident on a United Airlines plane in 2016 where a man, they had overbooked the flight for the airline attendants, meaning these airline attendants needed to get on this plane, and they offered people in the plane tons of money to get off, and not enough people said yes. And they ended up forcibly removing this gentleman. I'm sure most of you have probably seen this or heard this. And this was an awful PR business moment. And it is a truly haunting video to see. I really think that. And the initial tweet that the United Airlines CEO sent out in responding to this incident was, "I apologize for having to re-accommodate those customers." And Cecilia has seen the video. Well, all of you, where is the CEO's attempts here to reframe and to get us to the general public, the people who might buy United Airlines? Where is the framing in here? Will you put it in the chat? What is the selective use of words that he's trying to shape the reality of this moment for us? We'll wait about 15 seconds. Yeah, re-accommodate. Re-accommodate. So I don't know what you all think when you hear, again, we all have different backgrounds, different mental models, but I don't know what all of you hear when you, and I think this is tough when, if you haven't seen the video. Exactly, Daryl, like, what, re-accommodate? Yeah, exactly. Forget the image of a guy who was kicking and screaming. When I hear the word re-accommodate, that's me checking into a hotel and then saying, you know what, we initially had you in this room, we're gonna re-accommodate you in a room on the 4th floor. And what he didn't want us to think was, he didn't use the word remove. He didn't use the word physically restrain. Right? And so this is an attempt to construct a particular reality of that situation. And actually, this is an example of framing gone wrong, because he was absolutely criticized for this. He ended up having to do 3 different kinds of apologies. And then he even had to appear on Capitol Hill and speak to Congress about what happened. The classic CEO phrase, mistakes were made. And this also is a classic version of framing in a sort of manipulative way. The New York Times calls this the king of non-apologies. And what's happening here in terms of framing when we say mistakes were made is that mistakes were made, those 3 words actually don't activate a lot of associations or images. It's hard to for our brains to process these 3 words. They're just kind of floating a little bit. Mistakes were made. There's no human. There's no, this is a passive sentence. And so one strategy of saying mistakes were made is to basically say, I need to acknowledge this bad thing that happens, but I don't want to take any responsibility for it. So what happened with Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, was that a group of JP Morgan employees received big bonuses after the government subsidized TARP from 2008 and 2009, I believe. So basically, Jamie Dimon, and a lot of CEOs, and if you Google this phrase, you'll find a Wikipedia page that'll walk you through, all the presidents and all the CEOs and all the leaders who will use this phrase, mistakes were made, because again, it wants to shift, like literally almost jam our linguistic processors in our brain. So we just can't see anything, and it doesn't really activate much. Another fascinating rule of framing is that if there's a word that you don't want associated with you, don't use it. And so Richard Nixon, this might be a little bit of an older example for some of you, but for me, 41, I'm always familiar with this, is that the famous line from Richard Nixon, and I think if you were to ask right now on the street, at least in the United States, if you were to interview 100 people over the age of 30 or 40 and say, what word do you most associate with Richard Nixon? They say crook. And that was, that was Richard Nixon's intention, is to get you to think that he wasn't one, right? So one of the rules of framing is that if there's a word that you like, that you want to be associated with you, like, tricky Richard Nixon. If there's a word that you don't want to, if there's a word that you want to be associated with you, you use it repeatedly. So that's why Google has do the right thing, do the right thing, do the right thing. We're going to say that a lot because we want people to associate us with that phrase, do the right thing. And then if there's a word that you don't want associated with you, then don't use that word. And so this is why I don't want to get too deep into it. But if you look at any leaders or politicians who have talked about having affairs or anything like that, they never use the word affair. They never use that word because they don't want them to be associated with it. And they often, if there's an issue, they won't say the person's name. They'll just say the man or the woman. They won't say the name because then it more specifically associates them with that word. All right, so I want to talk about a quick case study because I've kind of been talking about framing and how it's used, but I want to give you a case study that's relatively direct, and then maybe I'll open up to the Q&A, and I'd love to hear anyone here who says either I've used framing, here's what I did, here's the words I use, and here's how it worked. I would love to hear that from anyone in the Q&A or in the chat. But then also maybe I also thought that if anyone wanted to kind of say, hey, I'm in the chat, you could say, I'm in this situation and how would I frame this? Obviously it'd have to be short enough. Maybe we don't want it to be too long, but I'm going to give you a case study, and then I'd love to open it up, to all of you, and we can kind of talk about this and really have a cool conversation about it. So I want to give you the case. Here's the situation. Let's say I'm at a company, and I really think that paternity leave, it would be a great thing for this company that I work at. And I think it's a moral obligation, perhaps. By the way, this is not necessarily the case for me, but I'm just saying, right? Like, let's say I think it's, we offer women paternity leave, and I think we should offer women maternity leave. We should offer men paternity leave. And I think this is kind of, this is the future of work, right? That this is how work organizations have progressed. They get more and more understanding and more caring. So I want paternity leave to come in at my company, but I'm going to have to influence and persuade senior leadership. So the wrong way, or the non-framing way, is I just write an email and say, look, I really think we should, I really think we should implement paternity leave. It's the right thing to do. This is just the right thing to do for society. Children, newborns, they need both their mother and father at home, and it's just better. It's just better for families. And as a company, we have a societal responsibility. All right, let me pause. There's likely a lot of problems with me assuming that would work. Right, so Pam's already thinking about how to frame it, right? And so it's funny, Pam, that's what you say, because what I want to begin with is not why I think paternity leave is the right idea, but why they might think paternity leave could be the right idea. And so I'm first going to just say, all right, my executives, what do they care about? What do they really motivate them? What do I've had these meetings with them. I've seen, emails they've sent out. I've seen, them present at big events. And I know that what they really care about is growth. And they really care about revenue, which sounds basically like what most executives and leaders are concerned about. And so, that doesn't necessarily align with my moral argument for why paternity leave is the right idea. So what if is there a way that I could begin with, here's revenue and here's growth and here's the company being successful, and how might paternity leave actually contribute to, significantly to the success and revenue of our company? So that's the place I'm going to begin, is like, I first start with them, not with me. And I almost have to try and forget why I think paternity leave is a good idea. And so I'm going to craft the message out of their worldview, not my own. And what I'm going to say is, oh, by the way, I should say, someone said parental leave, and that's probably a better way to say it in 2021, parental leave. I was just thinking that most places might have maternity leave. This is something that my wife and I had to deal with, and not a lot of places had So let's call it parental leave. Actually, I really like that idea better, parental leave. So we need full parental leave. And so what I don't want to say is parental leave is the right thing for society. Instead, I'm going to say, I could say things like this. I believe that providing parental leave would increase our ability. Yeah, you're right. It does make it an easier sell. It's a better frame, right? Providing parental leave would increase our ability to recruit top talent and continue to innovate, grow, and increase revenue. With expanded paternity leave, we have an opportunity to truly set ourselves apart from our competitors, which is, a major concern for leaders. Like, how do we get top people? How do we get top people that don't go to other places? And then in the race for top talent, expanded parental leave would put us at the head of the pack. And all of you are coming up with really great points. I could go deeper into I could provide financials. I think it would be really interesting to say among our competitors, those who offer full parental leave actually are producing, their annual growth revenue is the following, and I could try to link it. And I think people are bringing, I could provide all of these numbers. And I could say things like that, right? And so this little mini case study is just an example of, here's why I think something makes sense, but here's how I'm actually going to frame it. And the goal, I think, for all of us, as anyone who is a manager or anyone who is leading people or likely going to lead people, is I don't think it's fair to say everything we say to people at every time of the day is framed perfectly around their worldview. I don't think that's possible. But what I do believe is that we can aspire and we select, what are my core high stakes moments as a leader that I really need to focus on, that I have to get right. I think of things like, change management. I think of things like Zara said, the annual review, which is really high stakes. I think of large initiatives where you're trying to get people to change and to institute new policies. What often happens is we are the biggest evangelists of our own ideas, and we can't imagine that other people wouldn't believe it in the same way. So there's the other element to framing that's really important, is there's this issue of the curse of knowledge, which is that the more you understand something, the harder it is to explain it to people or to get people to care about it, because you cannot imagine what it's like to not understand or care about that thing. And so in a lot of ways, a lot of our communication is quickly trying to rewire our very ingrained, hardwired ways of believing, knowing, understanding, and thinking about things. So my last point for today is just this idea, and I might have a group of people who I might be preaching to the choir, which is totally cool, but is this idea of just use words like they matter, because they do. They really do. The other part that I love about my job and talking about communication and language and teaching as well is this idea that I believe that, so I'm thinking for all of you, and if you're trying to maybe spread these ideas in your organization or whatever it may be, but what I love is that if people are communicating really well, that means that there's more, and this might sound cheesy or cliche, but it means that there's more empathy in the world, right? Like that the more people are working to understand each other as a result of wanting to communicate better, like that actually, this is probably a world that we would all want to live in. So that is where I'm going to end for today. I want to go into any Q&As. If anyone has kind of a situation that they want to talk about, and I'll just sort of work. Daryl brings up some really interesting stuff about neuro-linguistic programming, which is something that I actually am not very knowledgeable about. And so I'm going to look into that, Daryl. That it sounds really cool. And aspects of motivational interviewing sounds really, really interesting as well. There's a question about students don't pay attention to my comments about their writing in a college level senior course. Any suggestions? And this is something, and I think even if, so it sounds like KX Leonard is as an educator, and I think like for anyone who might not be an educator, I think what we're going to talk about right now applies to anything, and just in terms of giving people feedback. So the first thing I would say to KX Leonard is this idea that I'm often with this kind of situation. I often think that I think that you need to figure out like the entire context of this communication situation. So let me explain. First is like how are students interpreting the project, like the assignment that you're giving them feedback on? Generally, I found that if students are very engaged in their project, they're more likely to pay attention to the comments that I give them. If they understand what's at stake for understanding the comments, meaning sometimes I think maybe the big theme of this is, and I think this is the case for most of us, not just educators, is that we generally need to be far more explicit than we think we do. Meaning, so for a college professor trying to get their students to read their writing, the idea is to say, you know, look, like the feedback that I'm giving you, I'm assuming you're going to take it, you're going to integrate it, you're going to revise it, you know, you're going to revise your paper based on what I've said. And so sometimes students don't even realize that. The other idea is to figure out what would motivate students. How would we frame this to get them to see the comments? This is really tough. And I was just talking with some MBA students who got very difficult feedback about a presentation. And I really I wanted to reframe how they experienced the feedback. Clearly what I wanted them to see is, you know, don't be beat up by this. Don't get dejected or demoralized. Don't feel like you're a horrible communicator or thinker with this feedback. See this as an opportunity. But you know, that it is it, and Cecilia's bringing up good points. Like, so oddly enough, what I needed to do, because that's what I wanted to say to them right when I met with them. They were very bummed about their presentation grade, one that I didn't give them, right? And I was about to jump in and say, look, you just need to, and I thought, you know what, let me listen first. And then they shared, okay. So Cecilia said young people are sensitive and it matters to them that adults care. And I think that's actually a really great point. So what I did with these students was, rather than just say, oh, look, feedback is great, you know, it's a way of improving, which actually probably is the wrong framing, because they're not going to believe that. I instead needed to, frame it around their career. Or I often, with MBA students and undergrads, talk about the difference between good and great. And, you know, if you want to be great, you're going to be open to this feedback. And I actually think the argument I make to them a lot, the frame I say is, there's a difference between, in your career, people who do well and people who do really well. And you might wonder, well, what's the difference? I would argue there's many factors, but the prime factor is communication. And the frame that I've offered up to students a lot is like, if you could be incredibly technical and incredibly smart about something, but if other people can't see that in a way that makes sense to them, it's almost not worth having that technical knowledge, because it's not being deployed in a way that creates value for other people. And so this is how I've tried to frame for the MBA students, that communication, which I think this is kind of what they think, communication is not the communication is not the cream, the frosting on after you've done the entire cake. Like, communication is the flour you select that is, composes the primary ingredients and the primary impact of the product, of the cake. Yeah, lots of cool food for thought here. Let me go into some of the questions. How important is framing in email communications with senior academic staff as a junior academic staff, this is actually a headache sometimes. Even if I try my best to be mild, they still find me rigid. Maybe I'm too straightforward. So this is a really great question. And I've actually, in my research with people at work, I found that the big critique, and when I've done consulting at organizations, what the manager brings me in and says, people aren't direct enough. You know, people just aren't clear enough. They're writing too much. And so for this example, I have had people though say to me, I've been told that I'm too direct. And the truth is this: there's no quick fix for this. And this is also that idea that, like, you are kind of getting at it. You say, maybe I'm too straightforward. So I have two things for this. One is, I actually think your directness in many ways in your career will serve you, will be a good thing. You know, that will be a good thing. So do not feel bad if you feel that you have a kind of natural directness. I don't think that's a thing. What I think I would do is, what would be very helpful is to have a colleague who can, we might call them the directness detector. And for any big email to a senior academic staff, just create time to be able to fire off that email to your friend who might have a little bit more subtlety and might have a different kind of approach to directness. Fire it off to them and say, hey, bring me down a little bit, or smooth this out. And that's what I would do for sure. It's funny because I've had recently a couple students, and I think this is great. This is the purpose of undergrad, is to get things wrong. And I have had students recently who wrote kind of like a bit too direct, and I was really trying to frame my feedback to them because I thought they were going to be really sensitive about it, but it worked out well. And the way I framed it was, you don't know all of the different kinds of professors that you're going to be emailing to, and so what you want to do is come in at the most thoughtful level possible. And then you can, as you email with them, you'll figure out more about them. But you would presume that you need to be ultra thoughtful all the time. And then as you have back and forth with them, then you might be able to be a little bit more direct. So, what about a good framing for a company to express support for equity, inclusion, and inclusion? Kelly, this is I think one of the most challenging issues right now. And I know at my university and specifically at our school, the Marshall School of Business, this is a big discussion going on. And I think that one of the challenges is that at its worst, at its least effective, perhaps sometimes framing can sound inauthentic. I think in around diversity, equity, inclusion, we talk about kind of virtue signaling, that these are just words, that this is a mere performance. And I think that my own view, and I'm not I should say too that I help people learn how to communicate, which is partly involved with PR or strategic communications, which I do have a background in. I worked in consulting in strategic communications and marketing. But my view, Kelly, on this, and again, I have to acknowledge that I'm not an expert, is that you really have to see the entire holistic approach that the company is taking, so that you need to figure out, well, what kinds of actions are we doing, and what kinds of messages are we creating, and what's the relationship between those actions and those messages. And because what I think, again, just from my relatively inexperienced view, is that I think there's a lot of companies that say, oh, we can put out a big message about diversity and equity and inclusion. And people are savvy today, and people relatively quickly will say, yeah, but what are you doing? Like, your words, those are just words. And so I think any company, what I would say is aligning your framing so that it helps people understand and see the actions that you're also taking, whether it's, all the different initiatives that people are taking right now around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But a great question, and also sort of a million-dollar question. That's a difficult one. Yeah, maybe do it and then say it, or exactly Kelly said, maybe you do the actions and then you say it. But I think there's also some, like, you really do want to craft a reality for people and make it authentic, and kind of, I think a lot of this is companies need to do the internal work and figure out, what is our DNA in relation to diversity, equity, inclusion. And because sometimes it might be really honest, like, we've got to do better. And that might be a refreshing frame for particular schools. Based off of their history or whatever it may be. So great. I don't see any more questions. And I just want to say, I really love doing these webinars. I love everybody jumping in. You always teach me. I now need to go check out, Daryl has filled me in on neuro-linguistic programming, which I'm going to check out, as well as motivational interviewing. And I really appreciate all of you joining today. What I will do is I'm going to repost that one link about our ProWritingAid 101. I'm going to repost that in the chat to all of you. And I think you'd all find Tom and Micah really compelling. Jim, thank you for that. Thanks very much for that resource. Sorry, I didn't put the links to the attendees. There we go. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining the webinar. And I look forward to seeing you all at future webinars. And I hope you have an excellent morning, afternoon, evening, late evening, and take care.